The morning began with the kind of brittle cold that made metal groan and radar arrays sluggish. A temperature drop that Soviet crews at the Chkalovsk Interceptor Regiment believed worked to their advantage. Cold air meant denser lift, cleaner engine response, and crisper radar returns. But it also meant something else, an atmospheric ducting effect that could bend signals in unexpected ways. The Americans knew that. They had studied it, logged it, and waited months for it. On the NATO side, the operation was already in motion long before the Soviets saw anything on their scopes. At 6:12 Zulu, an E-3 AWACS orbiting far west began feeding encrypted telemetry into Ramstein's Air Operations Center. Every sweep of its massive radar dish drew a clear, layered picture. Soviet patrols rotating on schedule, ground-based radars in Kaliningrad cycling through maintenance windows, and, most importantly, a gap opening in the P-19 radar coverage near the shoreline. Predictable gap. A documented gap. One that intelligence analysts had quietly labeled Corridor Amber. 2 F-15C Eagles from the 36th Tactical Fighter Wing slipped toward that corridor with a precision that came not from bravado but from doctrine. Their pilots weren't adrenaline junkies. They were engineers of controlled risk. Their task was not to fight but to pull the Soviets into a very specific stretch of airspace, one where the battlespace geometry shifted decisively in NATO's favor. They flew clean, without external tanks, relying on coordinated tanker timing to ensure they could maneuver aggressively without compromising the bait. Far across the frontier, inside a reinforced concrete bunker humming with 1980s Soviet electronics, an air defense captain named Viktor Malyshev watched his primary display with routine boredom. The Americans had been testing the borders for months. Intercept them, shadow them, send a report. Nothing unusual. But at 6:19, his system registered something he didn't like. The F-15s had turned eastward, too aggressively for a simple patrol adjustment. He leaned closer. "They're pushing the line today," he muttered. His deputy shrugged. "Standard behavior. They probe. We respond." But Malyshev noticed the altitude drop, the speed reduction, and the throttle-induced radar signature fluctuations. The Americans weren't probing. They were shaping the engagement. His instinct told him something was off, yet he followed procedure. Scramble 2 MiG-29s from the quick reaction alert shelter. Within minutes, twin trails of afterburning heat tore across the airfield, climbing fast into the gray Baltic sky. What Malyshev didn't know, what no one on the Soviet network realized, was that the F-15s were not alone. They were shepherding the MiGs directly toward Corridor Amber, where NATO's silent radars were waiting like a sprung trap, invisible and lethal. The scrambled MiG-29s climbed hard through a smear of contrails, their RD-33 engines leaving twin white signatures that AWACS operators immediately tagged and categorized. Nothing about their ascent surprised the American controllers. The Soviets were predictable down to the minute. The intercept geometry was unfolding exactly as the planners had drawn it months earlier on a wall-sized grid in a secure vault at Ramstein. Inside one of the F-15s, Captain Mark Ellery kept his breathing steady. His Eagle vibrated with controlled power, its APG-63 radar running strictly in passive mode. Ellery didn't need to see the Soviets on his own display. AWACS data piped through Link 11 already painted their positions with surgical clarity. He had been warned that this mission wasn't about air-to-air dominance. This was a shaping operation, a real-world test of electronic warfare theory under live pressure. His job was to be visible enough to provoke but restrained enough to avoid escalation. "Bandits airborne. Climbing. Heading 280, came the calm AWACS voice. Ellery replied, "Copy. Maintaining speed. No lock." Behind him, his wingman kept slightly lower, deliberately presenting the radar profile of a pair pulling away, an invitation the MiG pilots seized upon immediately. Soviet doctrine prized aggressive intercepts, especially against American fighters attempting to turn away from the border. To the two MiG pilots, the situation looked ideal. NATO aircraft withdrawing, a clear chance to push them back, and no obvious sign of a trap. But as the MiGs closed the distance, something in their cockpit displays began to shift. Their SPO-15 radar warning receivers flickered, not with the hard, steady tone of a missile lock, but with intermittent spikes that suggested scanning from nowhere. The signals were diffused, oddly displaced, as if the threat wasn't directly ahead but scattered across the horizon. Lieutenant Oleg Ivanovich, the lead MiG pilot, frowned at the jittering signal lights. "Ground, confirm enemy radar status," he requested. "Americans running cold," came the reply. "No emissions detected." But Ivanovich trusted his instruments more than the bunker's filtered data. The inconsistent spikes were classic symptoms of electronic manipulation, reflections, false returns, and delayed echoes created by a distant NATO jammer transmitting from a position the Soviets hadn't even detected yet. Ellery saw the first ripples of confusion on the Link 11 feed, MiG spacing widening, their formations tightening, then loosening again. Perfect. The trap only worked if the Soviets thought they were still in control. "Continue drift," AWACS instructed. "2 more miles. Hold heading." The F-15s complied, gliding deeper toward Corridor Amber. The MiGs followed, unaware that the sky ahead of them was not an empty intercept zone but the outer shell of a radar kill box. An invisible arena engineered to erase their situational awareness in a single, silent sweep. As the MiG-29s pushed another 5 kilometers into Corridor Amber, the entire electromagnetic texture of the battlespace shifted. Subtly at first, then catastrophically. To the pilots, it began as a faint delay in their target data. The F-15s, icons on the tactical display, hesitated, jittered, and then held position for a fraction too long. It was the kind of microstutter that only happened when multiple radars were fighting each other for dominance. Inside the Soviet command bunker, Captain Malyshev leaned forward, confused as his primary sweep painted a ghosted duplicate of the American aircraft. 2 echoes stacked imperfectly atop one another. The phantom trail. He slapped the side of the console, as though brute force could realign an entire radar network. The technicians scrambled to recalibrate, but the distortion grew. The F-15s now appeared to be in 2 positions at once, a sign of angular deception jamming. "Switch to secondary frequency," Malyshev ordered. His deputy hesitated. "Sir, that will drop tracking for." "Switch it." The radar image flickered, then plunged into static. For 3 heartbeats, their entire sector went dark. The cause wasn't a malfunction. It was NATO's Suter-style intrusion, an early prototype of network attack concepts that would later define 21st century warfare. The AWACS wasn't just watching. It was pushing selectively corrupted data into the Soviet radar chain, amplifying natural atmospheric ducting into a weapon. The F-15s had simply lured the MiGs into the preconfigured zone where the interference was strongest. In the cockpit of the lead MiG, Lieutenant Ivanovich's warning receiver exploded with nonsensical alerts, multiple pings from directions that made no physical sense. He yanked his throttle back instinctively, wary of an ambush. "What is happening?" his wingman shouted over the radio. "No picture," Ivanovich replied sharply. "Ground request vector. Ground." But the bunker could barely hear him. Malyshev's entire command suite was drowning in cascading false returns. Bogies multiplying across the scope like digital shrapnel. Deception pulses bounced between radars, creating a hall of mirrors effect. It looked to the Soviets like the sky was full of aircraft. Hundreds. At Ramstein, the NATO operations director observed the chaos with clinical detachment. "They've lost their picture," he said quietly. "Push them to commit." The AWACS controller keyed his mic. "Eagle lead, execute phase 2. Captain Ellery rolled gently to starboard, making the maneuver look hesitant, almost defensive. It was bait freshly seasoned. The MiGs, even half-blind, were culturally conditioned to pursue. They throttled up. They pressed forward. They flew deeper into the kill zone. And with every kilometer, their situational awareness unraveled further, until combat doctrine meant nothing and instinct became their only guide. For the first time in his career, Lieutenant Ivanovich realized he was chasing an enemy he could no longer describe. The F-15s ahead of him seemed to drift through molasses, slow, predictable, and temptingly close, yet every recalculated range number felt wrong. His radar showed them at 12 kilometers, then 9, then suddenly 14. No fighter in the world could jump that fast. His instruments weren't lying, they were being lied to. On the NATO side, Captain Ellery kept his tone even as his heart rate climbed. AWACS, confirm Phase 2 window. Window active. Soviet radar net fully compromised. Maintain distance. Do not lock. The instruction mattered. The operation wasn't about firing missiles. It was about demonstrating that NATO could hunt Soviet fighters without ever touching the trigger. A psychological strike wrapped in an electronic one. A kill zone didn't need to destroy anything. It only needed to prove that destruction could happen at will. As the F-15s continued their controlled drift, a second element of the plan activated. Hundreds of miles away, ground-based NATO radars silently pivoted toward the corridor. They did not radiate continuously. Instead, they pulsed in microbursts, nanosecond flashes that only AWACS could weave into a composite picture. To the MiGs, these pulses were invisible. But to their onboard computers, they were chaos. Tiny interruptions that scrambled data alignment and forced constant system resets. In the bunker, Captain Malyshev felt his throat tighten. His operators were shouting over each other now. Sector 4 radar is misaligned. No, the P-19 is seeing them. Wait. No, that's a reflection. They're jamming us from multiple vectors. Malyshev grabbed his headset. MiG lead, you are flying into compromised airspace. Break west immediately. But the message was garbled by the same spectral interference crippling the radar net. Ivanovich heard only fragments. Compromised, break west. And the ambiguity made things worse. His instincts screamed danger, yet his training hammered at him to complete the intercept. Then his threat receiver lit up in a way he had never seen. Steady, strong, and unmistakably real this time. A NATO fire control radar had just painted his aircraft. He snapped a breath. Missile lock. Defensive. Defensive. But there was no missile launched. The lock tone was deliberate, another psychological weapon. AWACS had fed targeting data to a ground-based radar station that momentarily engaged its emitter just long enough to trigger the warning in the MiG's cockpits. Ivanovich broke hard left, his wingman right. Their formation shattered instantly. Ellery watched from a distance, impressed despite himself. The MiGs weren't fleeing, they were surviving. But their split confirmed success. The Soviets were no longer hunting the F-15s. They were fighting ghosts, and the ghosts were winning. When the MiG formation shattered, the electronic battlefield shifted again, this time by NATO's choice. The AWACS controller throttled back the pressure, letting the jamming ebb just enough for the Soviets to regain a sliver of clarity. It was a psychological maneuver as deliberate as the trap itself. Give the adversary just enough control to realize how completely they'd lost it moments earlier. Captain Ellery leveled out, maintaining distance. He could have accelerated, could have turned the tables from feigned retreat to full dominance, but the mission parameters were sacred. No missiles, no merges, no escalation. His job was to demonstrate capability, not trigger Article 5. The F-15s held their line like chess pieces placed intentionally just out of reach. Lieutenant Ivanovich steadied his MiG-29 with a grunt. His HUD flickered back to life. The spurious contacts vanished. The sky was suddenly empty, wrongly empty. He couldn't reconcile it. 2 minutes earlier, he was surrounded by hostile signatures. Now there was nothing but cold air and static. What the hell happened? His wingman muttered. Regain altitude. Do not pursue. Ivanovich ordered, his voice tightening. Pride said push the intercept. Instinct said survive. Instinct won. Inside the bunker, Captain Malyshev stared at the returning radar picture with an expression somewhere between relief and dread. The F-15s were clear of the border zone now, gliding back into NATO airspace without a scratch. His operators looked exhausted, embarrassed, and angry. One finally spoke. Sir, this wasn't simple jamming. Malyshev nodded once. They were inside our network. He didn't say the rest aloud. If NATO could blind and manipulate their radar picture at will, then every assumption the Soviet air defense forces made about control, sovereignty, and deterrence had just been compromised. Hours later, a classified incident summary landed on desks in Moscow. The language was technical, clinical, intentionally bloodless. It attributed the failure to unexpected atmospheric anomalies, possible coordinated EW interference, and crew misinterpretation. No one dared write the truth, that the Americans had executed a controlled, multi-layered electronic ambush that the Soviet system was fundamentally unequipped to counter. In the NATO debrief, analysts didn't gloat. They observed. They documented. They refined the model. The corridor used for the trap, Corridor Amber, was quietly flagged as a repeatable vulnerability, exploitable again if tensions ever hardened into conflict. For the MiG pilots, the mission went down as a confusion event. For air defense officers, it became an uncomfortable footnote. But for the intelligence community, it was something else entirely, proof that air superiority no longer depended on missiles or maneuver, but on data, who controlled it, who shaped it, and who could make the enemy see ghosts. The Soviets never fully recovered their confidence in that sector. And they never learned how close they came to total blindness. In the weeks that followed, the incident dissolved from the public sphere as though it had never happened. No press releases, no diplomatic protests, no sharp exchanges at international summits. It lived only in classified logs and the strained nerves of the men who had been there. But inside the machinery of both superpowers, the engagement, brief, bloodless, and invisible to the world, triggered ripples that neither side would soon forget. At Chkalovsk, Lieutenant Ivanovich resumed flight rotations, but something in his confidence had fractured. He flew his MiG-29 with sharper caution, relying less on ground control, trusting his instincts more than the glowing icons on his displays. He never again believed the radar picture at face value. Every ghost contact, every flicker of interference, every unexplained tone sent adrenaline stabbing through his chest. The sky had become less predictable, less governed by rules. It had become manipulable. In the bunker below, Captain Malyshev submitted report after report, each one worded more cautiously than the last. He knew Moscow didn't want to hear that a cornerstone of Soviet air defense doctrine had been bypassed, not overwhelmed, but quietly outmaneuvered. His superiors offered sterile explanations. Atmospheric ducting, maintenance delays, operator error. None satisfied him. None addressed the truth. NATO, on the other hand, archived the mission under a bland codename, Spectral Drift, and moved on. But within the sealed corridors of Ramstein and Langley, analysts combed through terabytes of data harvested from the operation. The Soviets' reaction time, their radar cycling delays, the vulnerabilities in their P-19 network, all of it was fed into simulations. The kill zone had worked not because of American hardware superiority, but because of information discipline, timing, deception, synchronized emissions, and the ability to shape what the enemy saw. Captain Ellery completed his post-flight briefing with the professionalism expected of a man who had just walked through the edge of a Cold War knife fight. He didn't consider himself a hero. He considered himself proof that future wars would not be decided solely by pilots maneuvering in physical airspace, but by the invisible battlespace layered atop it. In a final assessment memo circulated only to senior NATO leadership, one analyst captured the significance succinctly. The Soviets froze because their systems trusted the wrong picture. Air combat dominance now begins before the first aircraft takes off. The trap over the Baltic was forgotten by everyone except those who understood its implications. Electronic warfare had rewritten the rules, and the sky, once the domain of pilots, was now governed by whoever could blind the other first.